This video introduces the sonnet form in Shakespeare's sonnet cycle. For this module, your readings will come not just from Icon, but the Folger edition of Shakespeare's sonnets that you purchased. What is a sonnet? A sonnet, particularly during the Renaissance, is epideictic. Try pronouncing this word, which is one of the possible IDs for the final. I'll say it a couple more times. Epideictic. Epideictic. Epideictic is a literary or rhetorical term that refers to a text that either praises or blames. Typically, an epideictic Renaissance text praises, and most often the object of praise is a woman. In other words, the term epideictic returns us in some ways to another ID that may appear on the final, blazon, or affectio. To better understand the term epideictic, let's look at its etymological roots, which lie in a Greek word that means show, convey, visualize, or represent. Sonnets praise someone by visualizing them or representing them. Insofar as epideictic means represent, it gets at the heart of language itself. That is, the word systems we use to represent the world. This next point is key. It's also a little bit tricky, so do jot this down. Sonnets are about the meaning of epideictic as much as they concern the person represented, that is, their object of praise. In other words, in addition to praising someone, a sonnet comments on the very act of praising. That is, it comments on the topic of visualizing someone through language. Sonnets engage the topic of representation through language as much as they concern what is being represented. So when you read a sonnet, ask yourself two things. How is the sonnet praising its subject? How is the sonnet commenting on the very act of using poetic language, on the very act of using poetry to praise? As we shall see, insofar as Renaissance sonnets concern the act of representing, they circle away from the object of praise to the person doing the praising, the poet. Indeed, ultimately, Renaissance sonnets are about celebrating not just the subject of praise, but the capacity of the poet to do the praising through language. An example of this doubleness with respect to praise, or the epideictic, is the work of the Italian poet who stands at the beginning of sonneteering in Renaissance Europe, Francis Petrarch. Who is praised in Petrarch's sonnets? Laura, the woman he claims to have fallen in love with at first sight, prompting him to leave the priesthood. But Laura sounds a lot like laurel, which is the leaf used to make the crown worn by great poets. Laurels have everything to do with poetic achievement, success. So Petrarch's sonnets concern not just Laura, but attaining the laurel crown. They are not just about a dynamic between a woman and the man who admires her, but the meta issue of the identity of the poet in the act of writing poetry. What we witness in a Renaissance sonnet is an epideictic dialectic. Dialectic is another ID that may appear on the final, so do write this information down. Dialectic can refer to many things. You may be familiar with the idea that dialectic refers to a dialogue between two persons. Here in this class, dialectic refers to a mode of analysis or critique. It is the process or phenomenon in which one concept, when pondered deeply, when thought about quite a bit, comes to resemble its supposed opposite. The dialectical discovery about a binary opposition, that what seems to be something's opposite isn't the opposite at all, but actually the thing itself, can generate shock or pleasure. Let's start with the binary of Laura and Petrarch, the poet and the lady, the celebrator and the celebrated or the praised. The closer we examine Petrarch's poetry, we discover that what Petrarch is praising isn't really this other person, the woman Laura, but himself, Petrarch. The binary of celebrator and praised breaks down as we think dialectically and realize that the celebrator is celebrating himself. As you read Shakespeare's sonnets, please do this. First of all, ask yourself, what is being praised? Then think carefully about how Shakespeare is engaging in the task of praising. What literary devices, poetic forms, themes, images, etc. is he evoking in order to praise, to be epideictic? Then ask yourself how the topic of the sonnet isn't just the person being praised, but the act of making a sonnet, of using poetry to praise. In what ways does the sonnet concern representation itself? Then, thinking dialectically, ask yourself how we can switch things around. How, in other words, does Shakespeare praise himself as a poet? I'll end this video by touching on the organization of Shakespeare's sonnet cycle. We have 154 extant or existing sonnets by Shakespeare, which he wrote over the course of the end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th centuries. His sonnets were published in 1609. There is a logic to the organization of Shakespeare's sonnets. The first 17 are addressed to a young man. Shakespeare is being very much the Renaissance humanist, since classical works often celebrated young men. The message these initial sonnets tend to offer is, young man, marry and replicate your beauty. Make it eternal. In other words, biological reproduction is a key theme. Sonnets 18 to 126 shift from biological to poetic reproduction. They concern again Shakespeare's love and admiration for the young man, but they also concern the preservation of the young man through Shakespeare's sonnets. The final group of poems in the cycle concern a dark and treacherous woman. They may indicate the presence of a love triangle between Shakespeare, the lady, and the young man. Each sonnet follows a particular rhyme scheme and meter. Like Chaucer's poetry, Shakespeare's sonnets are written in iambic pentameter. Here, I've indicated the rhyme scheme for the sonnets, using the example of Sonnet 3. As you read Shakespeare's sonnets, please consider how this formal organization contributes to Shakespeare's epideictic goals. How do the couplet and quatrains relate to each other? Keep in mind that as good close readers, no detail is too small.
I have to celebrate you, baby. I have to praise you like I should.